There was a man who did everything right. He wasn't perfect, but he was described as blameless and upright. A man who feared God and turned away from evil. He had a full house, a thriving business, a good name in his community, 7 sons and 3 daughters who gathered together in celebration. By every measure that we tend to use to judge whether someone's life is working, his life was working. And then, in the span of what feels like a single afternoon, all of it was gone. If you have ever done everything you knew how to do, prayed the right prayers, made the responsible choices, tried to live with integrity, and still watched your life come apart at the seams anyway, then the story we're stepping into today was written with you in mind. Because this isn't a story about a man who suffered because he did something wrong. It's a story about a man who suffered while doing everything right, and what he discovered about God in the wreckage of everything he lost. His name was Job, and before this day is over, you are going to understand something about faith that most people never learn until they're standing in the middle of their own collapse. Something that could change the way you hold on to God the next time your life feels like it's falling apart. Here's why this story matters so much, especially now. Most of us have been taught, even if no one said it directly, that if we do the right things, life will hold together, that faithfulness earns protection, that good choices guarantee good outcomes. And when life doesn't work that way, when the diagnosis comes anyway, when the marriage ends anyway, when the business fails anyway, when the loss happens anyway, it doesn't just hurt, it shakes something deeper. It makes us question whether God is still good, still present, still paying attention. Job's story exists to answer that exact question. Not with easy explanations, but with something far more durable, a picture of what it actually looks like to keep faith when there is no explanation in sight. By the time we finish walking through this together, you're going to have real, practical truth you can hold on to the next time your own life feels like it's unraveling faster than you can hold it together. Before we continue, I want to bring you into this with me. Wherever you're watching from today, whether you're in a season that feels stable or whether you're in the middle of your own collapse right now, I want you to type one word in the comments: steadfast. Just that word. Because somewhere in this story, you are going to be reminded that faith isn't the absence of devastating loss. It's what remains standing after the loss happens. And when you look back through those comments later, you'll see believers from every corner of the world declaring the same thing over their own storms. This is exactly why this channel exists, not to hand you easy answers when life gets hard, but to walk with you through the stories that show real people wrestling with real pain and finding that God was still there the whole time. If that kind of companionship on the journey means something to you, consider subscribing, not to grow a number, but to keep building a community of people who refuse to let go of faith when life gets difficult. Now let's step into the story itself, because what happens to Job in a single day is almost impossible to comprehend. The book of Job opens with a man at the height of everything good: wealth, family, reputation, and a heart described as blameless before God. Then, in Job chapter 1, messenger after messenger arrives in rapid succession, each one interrupting the last with worse news. Raiders had stolen his oxen and donkeys. Fire had fallen and consumed his sheep. Another raiding party had taken his camels. And then the final messenger arrives with news no parent should ever have to hear. A great wind collapsed the house where all 10 of his children were gathered, and none of them survived. In the space of minutes, Job lost his wealth, his workforce, and every one of his children, and it's what he does next that becomes the foundation for everything we're about to learn. Lesson 1. Grief and worship are not opposites. Job 1:20 tells us that when Job heard this news, he tore his robe and shaved his head. Both were customary expressions of deep grief and mourning in that culture. And then, remarkably, he fell to the ground in worship. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Notice what Job does not do. He does not suppress his grief. He does not put on a brave face and pretend he isn't devastated. He tears his robe. He shaves his head. He lets his body express the depth of what his heart is carrying. And in that very same moment, he also worships. This matters so much for anyone who has ever felt like they had to choose between honest grief and genuine faith, as if falling apart somehow proves your trust in God was never real, or as if worshiping through tears is some kind of contradiction. Job shows us it isn't. Grief and worship can occupy the exact same moment. You can be shattered and still turn your face toward God. You can weep and still whisper His name with reverence. One does not cancel out the other. If you are in a season of loss right now, hear this clearly. You do not have to fake strength in order to remain faithful. You do not have to hide your tears to prove your trust. Bring your torn robe and your worship into the same room. Let your grief be honest, and let your faith be present in the middle of it, not after it's over. The practical application here is simple but life-changing. Stop believing the lie that falling apart means falling away. You can grieve loudly and still belong to God fully. That was true for Job, and it is true for you. Lesson 2. Faith that only exists when life is good was never truly tested. Earlier in the story, before any of the tragedy strikes, there's a conversation happening that Job himself never hears. In Job chapter 1, the accuser suggests to God that Job only serves him because his life is comfortable, that if everything Job had was stripped away, he would curse God to his face. It's a challenge to the authenticity of Job's faith, a suggestion that his devotion is really just gratitude for good circumstances wearing the costume of faith. This raises a question worth sitting with honestly. How much of our own faith is a response to God Himself, and how much of it is really a response to the blessings we assume come from Him? It's an uncomfortable question, but an important one. It's easy to feel close to God when prayers are being answered, when the paycheck comes through, when the relationship is thriving, when the health report comes back clear. But what happens to that same faith when the blessings are removed? Does it hold, or does it reveal that we were really just trusting the gifts instead of the giver? Job's response, in the aftermath of everything being taken from him, becomes the answer to that very question. Even in devastating loss, he does not curse God. He continues to speak of Him with reverence. His faith was not a transaction built on good circumstances. It was a relationship that could survive the absence of them. This is such an important check for our own hearts. If everything comfortable in your life were removed today, would your faith still stand? Not perfectly, not without pain, but would it still be there? This isn't meant to condemn you if the honest answer feels shaky. It's meant to show you what real, tested faith actually looks like, and to invite you to start building that kind of foundation now, before the storm comes, rather than trying to construct it in the middle of the wreckage. The challenge here is to examine what your faith is actually resting on. Is it resting on God's character, or on the circumstances you've come to associate with His presence? Job's story invites you to root your trust so deeply in who God is that even if everything else changed, your faith wouldn't move. Lesson 3. Well-meaning people will sometimes offer you the wrong explanations for your pain. Once word spreads of Job's suffering, 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come to sit with him. At first, Job 2:13 tells us they simply sat with him in silence for 7 days and nights, recognizing the depth of his suffering was too great for words. That part, honestly, is beautiful. But once the conversation begins, their comfort quickly turns into accusation. Across the chapters that follow, each of them, in different ways, insists that Job's suffering must be the result of hidden sin. Surely, they reason, God would not allow this much pain to fall on an innocent man. Job must have done something to deserve it. This is such a familiar pattern, even now. When someone we care about is suffering, we often feel a desperate need to explain why, as if an explanation will make the pain more manageable or restore our sense that the world still makes sense. But sometimes suffering doesn't come with a tidy explanation. Sometimes the most loving thing anyone can do is exactly what Job's friends did at first. Simply sit in the ashes with someone, without trying to solve or explain their pain away. If you have ever been on the receiving end of someone else's well-intentioned but painful explanations for your suffering, someone suggesting you must have done something to deserve it, or that you just need more faith, or that everything happens for a clear and identifiable reason, know that Job's story validates your frustration. Even God, later in the book, rebukes Job's friends for speaking wrongly about him. Their theology was neat and tidy, but it wasn't true, and it added pain rather than relieving it. And if you're ever the one trying to comfort someone else who is suffering, let this be your practical takeaway. Resist the urge to explain their pain. Offer your presence before you offer your theories. Sometimes the 7 days of silence matter more than anything you could ever say. Lesson 4. It's possible to remain faithful and still ask honest, painful questions. As the chapters unfold, Job does not remain silent or composed. He speaks openly about his confusion, his exhaustion, and his desire to simply understand why this has happened to him. In Job 3:11, he even asks why he didn't die at birth. Throughout the middle chapters of the book, he wrestles, he questions, he pushes back, and at times he sounds almost like he's arguing a legal case before God, demanding an audience, demanding an answer. This might surprise people who assume that real faith means never questioning God, never expressing confusion, never admitting that something feels unfair or incomprehensible. But Job's honesty is never treated in this book as the opposite of faith. In fact, by the end of the story, God does not condemn Job for his questions. What God does object to, later on, is the false certainty of Job's friends, not the raw, aching honesty of Job himself. This offers something so freeing for anyone who has ever felt guilty for asking God hard questions in the middle of pain. Why did this happen? Where were you? How long is this going to last? These are not signs of a faith that's failing. They can be signs of a faith that is still fully engaged, still reaching toward God, even in confusion, rather than a faith that has quietly walked away and stopped caring enough to ask. The practical application here matters deeply. You do not have to perform certainty you don't feel in order to remain faithful. You can bring your real questions to God, even the desperate and uncomfortable ones, and still be exactly where He wants you, close enough to keep talking to Him rather than distant enough to have given up. Faith is not the absence of hard questions. It's the decision to keep bringing those questions to God instead of away from Him. Lesson 5. There are some answers God never gives, and peace can still be found without them. After chapters of Job demanding an explanation, something unexpected happens. God finally speaks, beginning in chapter 38, but not in the way anyone might expect. He does not explain why the tragedy happened. He does not lay out the conversation that took place, the one Job was never shown. Instead, God responds with an overwhelming series of questions of His own. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bind the beautiful Pleiades or loose the belt of Orion? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Question after question, drawing Job's attention to the vastness, the order, and the wisdom woven into creation itself. At the end of this, Job never receives the explanation he had been demanding, and yet, in Job 42:5, he says something remarkable. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Something shifted, not because his circumstances were explained, but because his perspective of God expanded. This is such an important truth for anyone still waiting on an explanation for their own suffering that may never come. Sometimes we assume peace can only arrive once we finally understand why something happened. Job's story suggests something different, that peace can come not from having every question answered, but from encountering the size, the wisdom, and the trustworthiness of God Himself. The explanation was never the thing that satisfied Job. The presence of God was. If you are still waiting for the why behind something painful in your own life, and it hasn't come, and you suspect it may never come, let this be your encouragement. You do not need every explanation in order to find peace. What you need is a bigger view of who God is. Spend time not just asking why, but seeking to know Him more deeply, and let that relationship become the ground your peace stands on, rather than an explanation you may never receive. Lesson 6. God's faithfulness often continues on. The other side of the waiting, even when it looks nothing like what was lost. The story of Job does not end in the ashes. Job 42:10 tells us that after Job prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. His wealth was restored beyond what it had been. He had more children. His later years, the text tells us, were blessed even more than his earlier ones. But it's important to notice something here, something easy to miss if we rush past it. The children he lost were not replaced in a way that erased his grief. New children came, but the ones who were gone remained gone, remembered, mourned. Restoration in this story is not a magic eraser that pretends the loss never happened. It's a picture of God's faithfulness continuing to move forward, even after devastating loss, building something new without demanding that the pain be forgotten first. This offers such a grounded, honest hope for anyone walking through their own season of loss. Restoration does not always look like getting back exactly what was taken. Sometimes it looks like God building something new alongside the grief, not instead of it. Your healing does not require you to pretend the loss didn't matter. It simply requires you to keep walking forward with God, trusting that He is still writing a story, even in chapters that look completely different from the ones that came before. If you are in a season where everything feels like ashes right now, let Job's ending speak directly to you. This is not necessarily where your story stops. God's faithfulness did not run out when Job's tragedy struck, and it has not run out in your life either. The next chapter may look different than you expected, but that does not mean it can't still be good. There is something deeply steadying about walking through this entire story from beginning to end. Job did not hold on to his faith because he understood everything that happened to him. He held on to it because, somewhere underneath the grief and the questions and the friends who got it wrong, he still knew God was worth trusting, even when nothing made sense. That is the invitation sitting at the center of this whole story for you today. You may be in a season where the losses are piling up faster than you can process them. You may have people around you offering explanations that feel more like accusations. You may have questions you've been almost afraid to say out loud to God. Let Job's story give you permission for all of it. Permission to grieve honestly, permission to ask hard questions, permission to admit you don't understand, and permission to keep worshiping anyway, not because you've figured it all out, but because you know, underneath everything, that God is still who He says He is. Your ashes are not the end of your story. They may simply be the soil something new is quietly being built in. If this encouraged you today, I'd love for you to like this video, and if stories like this speak to where you are, consider subscribing so we can keep walking through Scripture together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.